see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogues on How to Build a Culture of Empathy and Compassion. And today I'm here with Daryl Cameron. Thanks for joining me, Daryl.
Thank you, Edwin.
Yeah, so just wanted to get started off with a little bit of a background about you. And you're a doctoral candidate in this social psychology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And your research focuses on the causes and consequences of compassion regulation.
Yes, that's correct.
Do you want to give a little bit more background, about yourself and anything
Sure.
else that you think is important?
So yeah, I'm finishing up my graduate school training at UNC in social psychology. I work primarily with Keith Payne, but also with Barbara Fredrickson. So the research that I've talked about the most is this idea of when we avoid compassion for others, when there are lots of people that are at stake. So in things like natural disasters, genocides, and so forth. And how those kinds of situations can be especially likely to make us want to avoid our feelings of compassion. So, and I have a few studies that tease out that dynamic. As for the consequences of compassion, I have some recent work looking at what happens when you avoid compassion for others. And does it change how you think about your sense of morality?
Oh, well, we can go into that. I thought maybe we'd start with, finding out a little bit about yourself. And to start with, I can show, screenshots on the screen here, and I'm looking at your Facebook page, and you have a beautiful scene there of a lake and some mountains. I was wondering,
sure.
What's that all about?
Sure. So I love photography generally, but that was actually in Telluride, Colorado. So I was recently in Telluride for the Science of Compassion conference, hosted by Seacare, and I had the chance to drive through some of the beautiful mountain scenery. It was my first time in the Rockies. It's my first time that deep into the Rockies, so the vistas were wonderful. It was a great trip. That was just back this July, and so I think they're actually going to post the videos conference sometime fairly soon. But yeah, so my wife is an English PhD candidate, so she's in English literature. So we're a couple of nerdy academics. But yeah, she's also here at UNC Chapel Hill. We both went to the College of William and Mary for undergraduate, a small liberal arts college up in Williamsburg, Virginia. I did a background in philosophy for my undergraduate degree, and I turned to social psychology because I kind of felt that no offense to philosophers, they are wonderful. I know many of them, I work with many of them, but it felt like social psychology would afford me the empirical tools to address some of these long-standing philosophical questions like compassion and altruism from a more scientific, empirically derived framework.
Okay, so the philosophy is more of a cognitive, thinking process, and you're wanting kind of the nuts and bolts of the science of it to really look at empathy, compassion from that point of view.
Yeah, so I felt like, psychological science is in a unique position where we ask these socially and philosophically important questions, but we can then put them to an empirical test. And we can, it's not going to provide definitive answers. As with anything, science is kind of reiterative. You're going to find results that challenge other results, but that's what's beautiful, because you can then compare and contrast, and you have an objective set of data to look at.
Well, what got you started in looking at compassion? Was there some kind of story, some anecdote of, you had a big aha moment that this is really important, or was it like a slowly developing process? Or
so I wish I could say that I had like some distinctive aha moments. It was more of a kind of a slow evolution. I read Peter Singer, Peter Unger, these wonderful books that talk about failures of compassion. And growing up, I've always, been struck by failures of compassion for like homeless people, for animals, and it happens so much in everyday society. So you see all these scholars write about how compassion is this fundamental moral force. It attunes us to the harms that befall others. It's really important for cooperation and forgiveness and all these other ostensibly positive moral outcomes. And yet it's one of the most fickle moral emotions. It's one of the emotions that fluctuates the most and that people seem to have the most people turn it off quite frequently. So the contrast between the central importance of compassion on the one hand and its feeble kind of fluctuating presence on the other is, I found, especially striking.
And it sounds like you think that by studying it and having the data for it, it might kind of strengthen the compassion in that sense.
Well, if we can understand the conditions in everyday life when people are going to be motivated to turn off their compassion, and we can show how we can perhaps persuade them to do something different, knowing about those causal conditions can help us to, build compassion. It can give us a kind of an empirically based way of approaching how to build compassion for others.
Well, one thing I find in just when I talk to people is to kind of find out where they're coming from in terms of their most important value in life. What would be your most important value? I mean, if you had to boil it down to one, or maybe two at the most.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure anyone's ever asked me that before. I guess my most important value would be something like perspective. I don't know. I don't know if you can call this a value, more like a skill, perspective taking, like the importance of trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes, and perhaps that's a precondition for compassion or empathy. But just this idea, a kind of, maybe another way of saying this is a kind of a humility about your own viewpoint. So I have a lot of things that I'm sure I'm wrong about, even as certain as they may sometimes seem. If I try to take that step and change perspectives, perhaps I will gain more insight onto how the world's working. So again, to answer your question, I think something like perspective taking, or the importance of being humble about one's own viewpoint.
Mm-hmm. So the humility is just not being so attached to one's viewpoint and be willing to, and not like this is the right way and this is how it has to be, and really be. It's like be kind of open about it. And how did that become important to you? It's like, is there something that happened in your life that actually I interviewed Per Carlo, who and he said something very similar. And he said it was his father who was a very opinionated person, and he didn't like that. So I don't know, is there something like that for you, or how did that come about that became important?
I mean, again, I don't know that I have like a specific incident that motivated me to adopt that value. I mean, I remember my grandfather, who was one of my biggest role models throughout my childhood. He always emphasized the importance of trying to get as many perspectives on an event as possible. So he encouraged me, he's like, well, don't just read this newspaper that might have one political stance, read another paper that has different stance, and then you can kind of get a sense of, okay, what's shared here, what's important, what's spin, what's the really important thing to focus on. So I mean, maybe it's partially his influence. But then once I entered philosophy, when I did philosophy in college, I mean, you could argue that much of what philosophy is people. Well, this is, as I'm saying this, I realize it's kind of contentious. Some have argued that much of that philosophy often reflects the personal experiences of the philosopher in question. So I always enjoyed, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It can be very valuable. And when I was an undergraduate, I really enjoyed delving into different philosophical systems, trying to understand them from the perspective of the author. I've always enjoyed reading novels, which can afford the same kind of experience. And then as a psychologist, it really becomes all about trying to get past your own assumptions about how people are acting and actually test those assumptions in the real world. So I think it's kind of a mix of my personal background, my family experiences, with the professional kinds of things that I've been learning in the past decade or so.
Well, when you were talking about perspective taking, it kind of made me think about definitions. And for me, I would say perspective taking is about empathy, and the definitions of empathy, it's like one of the parts of it are perspective taking. So in terms of definitions, how are you seeing, perspective taking, empathy, and compassion? Kind of, how are you defining those?
So yeah, that's a really good question. I know it's one that there's a lot of debate over right now as to how to carve up those terms within the psychological literature, at least. I would say, in my work, I've kind of cleaved to the definition of empathy as So you hear like affective empathy as kind of compassion, and cognitive empathy as perspective taking, mental state inferences and that kind of thing. That might be one way to separate it. Another way to think about it, I've been really enamored of Tanya Singer's recent definition of empathy, thinking about empathy as a kind of vicarious sharing of affective experiences with someone, and then that could then transition into either the experience of compassion, which is this warm, other-focused emotion, or the experience of distress, which is this more negative, self-focused, kind of antisocial emotion. Now, as for where perspective taking would fall in that sequence, you might argue that perspective taking is necessary to trigger empathy in the first place. And I think that is, so to open that to open that kind of vicarious sharing to begin with, you might need to open yourself up to taking that person's perspective in the first place. And I think that, I could be wrong about this, but I think that Dan Batson's research, he posits that perspective taking as a precursor to any form of compassion or empathy.
Yeah, sorry.
What's up? Go ahead.
Oh, I had interviewed Dan about this. He wrote a chapter in a book on empathy, and he kind of laid out 8 different ways that the word is used, and they're kind of all over the place. And he says the definitions is not so important. It's just that you say how you're using the word, and then you kind of stick to it, was kind of how he'd kind of approached it. So it is a little bit of a mess in terms of the definitions. I just saw a talk by Tanya Singer where she was laying out her definition, and she was seeing it as emotional contagion. She was saying empathy was perspective taking in the sense of self-awareness and then being able to take perspectives. And then she was saying then there was, wanting to alleviate pain was a compassion component. And then she was creating 2 charts. One was with that as one is one circuit in the brain. And then the other one was theory of mind is like a separate route. And she was saying like a psychopath could have, theory of mind and be able to, use their insight into manipulation. So there are a few different. And then,
agree that, yeah, it could be possible that a psychopath could use advanced theory of mind reasoning to manipulate others. Yeah, so that's interesting to think about, certainly.
Yeah, so it's a project I'd like to do, is to really kind of nail down this definitions. Maybe I can just throw out a definition of how I'm using the term so that we kind of have a common language here. I'm seeing empathy as actually 4 parts. There's self-empathy, which is sensory awareness, mindfulness of what's going on inside of myself. There's mirrored empathy, which is through mirror neurons, that as you lift the cup, that's a, that my mirror neurons are firing, I'm mirroring you, and I'm seeing you smile, and I can feel your smile, and those motions. So that's kind of like this mirrored empathy. And then the cognitive, what's sometimes called cognitive empathy or perspective taking, I use the word imaginative empathy, but it's kind of for that category that is we have self-awareness, that we can imagine somebody else's situation and what they're kind of going through from kind of their point of view. And then the 4th part is empathic action, that is we kind of connect with each other and see our common humanity. It's how we interact with each other, kind of holding each other's humanity. And then that is the same for me for compassion, in the sense that compassion would be a slice. It would be that process applied to suffering in others. Like I could be empathizing with your emotions and the movement, and you're scratching yourself, and I can feel the scratch, and I can empathize with that. And if I think, oh, I'm scratching, I'd give you a back scratcher or something, or what I mean? I would be contributing to your welfare because I'm holding your and my welfare together. But if you're in pain, then the compassion is that aspect of how does empathy interrelate with someone's pain, and it tends to be with consolation kind of behavior. So that's kind of the framework that I use. I'm just wondering how that resonates and kind of fits in with how you're seeing it.
I think that the way I've used compassion in my research, at least, it is this idea of focusing on someone else's suffering. So it is about, in all my studies that talk about compassion, I use this definition by Gates, I think it's Getz, Keltner, and Simon Thomas, in which they talk about compassion as the emotion that motivates the alleviation of suffering in others. So it does have that. It is attached to suffering in another person. So that's so yeah, that's a definition I've used. So it's consistent with your notion of holding the suffering of another person with oneself. So yeah, so I think there's some commonality there, definitely.
Okay, so your work and research is kind of focused on the how do we interact with others' suffering, and how do we empathize and have compassion with the suffering that we see in the world, maybe inside of ourselves. Exactly. Are you addressing like self-compassion too? Do you use that, like, you know, Kristen Neff has the...
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I think self-compassion is a wonderfully intriguing concept. I've not used it in my own work, but I could see connections. So I think Kristen Neff wrote an interesting piece for the Huffington Post maybe a few months ago, and she talked about how does self-compassion relate to things like compassion fatigue. So how do, you know, if you don't have much compassion for yourself, how would that influence how you have compassion for others, especially if you're in a profession where you're constantly asked to have compassion for others, like in the medical professions, etc. And she argues in that piece, if I recall correctly, that, you know, increasing self-compassion might be kind of a buffer against compassion fatigue, against becoming burnt out by feeling compassion for others on a chronic basis. But we haven't tested it. I mean, it's certainly possible that if you feel that if I'm faced with the suffering of a lot of people, and I feel like, well, I just can't handle it, but then I think to myself, okay, you can do this. You have the abilities in you to address this situation. That could motivate people to turn towards these other suffering victims and try to help. But that is an open empirical question that, as far as I know, hasn't been addressed.
Mm-hmm. So you're really taking these different ideas and concepts and a way of looking at it and saying, how do we apply scientific study to it, create some kind of tests that can kind of test what's really kind of going on here, kind of empirically, so you have kind of like data to show.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we kind of dig into that, you know, in terms of definitions, I find that metaphors are a fun way of defining these terms. So, you know, empathy is often defined as the metaphor of standing in someone else's shoes or looking through someone else's eyes. For me, empathy is like a cornucopia, in that it opens up the door to a rich experience. And so I was wondering if you were kind of defining, you know, empathy and compassion metaphorically, do you have any that kind of come to mind? Like, what is empathy like for you as a metaphor, if you were describing it metaphorically?
That's a really interesting question. Let's see. Maybe something like, given the fragility of compassion and the ease with which people can turn it off, perhaps something like a fragile flower, maybe. Like it's because on one hand it's potent and its beauty could really motivate quite a lot of inspiring action, but by the same token, it's easily left unattended, undeveloped, or even actively trampled. So maybe something like a delicate flower, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
a good question.
Yeah, how about for empathy? What would be your metaphor? I think I really like that one myself. I mean, it really resonates. You can smell the fragrance of the flower. You know, if you kind of crush the petals, you'll destroy them. But there's this there's this wonderful beauty in the flower, and it's so inspiring to us too.
Yeah, so for empathy, that one's tougher. Empathy is tougher. I would say, you got me stumped, Edwin.
Okay, well, you can think about it while we're going. If it kind of strikes you that I could just say,
I'll let it go.
Yeah, for me, compassion would be like a warm bath. You know, I mean, that's the part that I kind of think of, because the compassion has a real kind of warm feel to it, to me. So it's that part of the metaphor, you know, the warm is I need to work on that metaphor myself too. But I
No,
think,
I can see it. It works. It works.
yeah,
Maybe for empathy, I'm getting just in terms of the images that are going through my mind as I'm trying to think of a metaphor. I mean, maybe something like a mirror, like just, but that I'm not sure if that fully captures the affective nature of it in many circumstances, but something that implies this point-to-point connection with someone. I don't know if a mirror works. I'll keep unconsciously thinking through this as
yeah,
we talk.
it'll come to you. You know, maybe even while you're taking a shower, suddenly, you know,
Aha.
whatever. The somehow I found that the metaphors really kind of add something as a way of, and everybody's metaphor is different. It's amazing. Some people have said for empathy, it's like water flowing, you know, in the sense that you're taking on any shape, and the opposite for them was ice, right, for it being frozen.
Mm.
And then somebody else
Yeah.
said it's like strings in harmony, and then the opposite
That's
for
good.
them
That's good.
was scratching on a chalkboard. You know, I know you feel it. See, it's so
Yeah.
visceral.
So yeah, yes, that last one is I think really interesting. This idea of a kind of almost like a harmony, a kind of attunement, and that harmony could be good or it could be something very atonal. It could be something that's very, but the idea of harmonizing between two people, and that could go any number of directions, good or bad. I like that. I like that.
Yeah,
The
well,
musical.
I've got a whole bunch of them. I'm collecting those. You can check them out on the website. So okay, well this is great. This is a great kind of start. I think we've kind of set the stage now for your work. Perhaps you could go into like your work and maybe how it's been progressing and where you want to go with it with your studies.
Sure. So I think the best place to start is with this phenomenon that really captivated me. It was kind of depressing in some ways, but I think that the research I've done on it has a positive upshot for how to build compassion. So we've all faced situations when there are a lot of people suffering, like natural disasters, genocides, places that have endemic poverty. And these situations are arguably those in which we need to feel the most compassion. Because so many people are suffering, we should, given the value of each human life, arguably feel more compassion and want to help all the more. Right? Many people arguably would hold this as a moral principle. But so if you ask people, how much compassion would you feel if there were more people suffering in a crisis, people think they will feel more compassion when there are more victims. Their prediction is, I would feel more compassion if more people are suffering. But when you bring them into the laboratory and measure how much compassion do they feel towards, say, one victim on the one hand or 8 victims on the other, you see a surprising counterintuitive result. People actually feel more compassion for one victim than for many victims. So that's the first part of what I'll focus on. It's been called the collapse of compassion. It's been replicated many times by many different research teams. It really is kind of striking because it's not just that, if you add 7 victims to that single victim, your compassion just increases a little bit in a kind of diminishing return. But it's that you actually feel less than you would have if you had just seen one victim.
Mm.
So we thought, why does this happen? This seems like especially counterintuitive in a lot of ways. And it's also it's a kind of situation and a kind of psychological case study that has a lot of moral weight, you might argue. Again, because this is a situation where we want to feel a lot of compassion, or at least many people would want to feel a lot of compassion. So our argument is that, let me take a step back. This has been written about before, and others had argued that there are constraints on how much compassion we can feel towards multiple victims, that it's hard to attend to that many victims at once. We just don't have a very strong emotional gut reaction when we hear about thousands of people suffering or dozens of people suffering. The argument that was out there before I did my research was that we simply don't have much capacity to feel compassion for these large crises. We wanted to argue for a different perspective. We posited that, well, if you think you're going to feel more compassion when more people are suffering, you might become concerned about potential costs of that emotional experience. You might be concerned, well, geez, if I really let myself feel compassion for that many people, am I going to become emotionally overwhelmed and get burnt out? Or you might think about the financial costs. You may think, well, I can't help everyone in the world, and it would just be too expensive. It would be too much of a financial burden. And for either of those reasons, and there might be others, we argue that people take steps to actively turn off their feelings, such that it's not a basic constraint on how much compassion we feel towards people, but rather it's the end result of a choice to turn away from our compassion. So what that means is that this collapse of compassion should only emerge under certain conditions. It should only emerge when people have the motivation to turn off their compassion. So we can move that motivation around, which is the cool part. That's what's suggestive for the practical implications of my studies. And also, we should find that this collapse of compassion depends upon how well people can control their emotions. To the degree that the collapse of compassion is a motivated emotion control strategy, we should find that it changes depending upon whether people can control their emotions. So that's our theoretical approach. I can certainly go into empirical details if you'd like, or if you wanted to just talk theory, what do you prefer?
Well, let me see if I heard this. So it's that when if I see an individual that's is suffering, that my compassion has a certain level, but then as there's more and more people, that my compassion actually doesn't rise; it actually kind of diminishes. And it sounds like that what was coming to me is that when you think in terms of the needs of those other people, are you holding simultaneously the needs of yourself too? Like, it's like that's the notion of self-compassion, that I hold equally my needs as well as the needs of others, because I know I when going, I'm on the street and there's panhandlers there, I could, make a whole big project of seeing what's going on for them. But for me, I feel like, oh, geez, that would be just too overwhelming. The whole society structure is, structured in a way that it's creating this environment. I could give all my money to everybody. And in fact, a friend of mine once did that in India. He was, in the 60s, we were kind of like exploring, the 70s. And we were in India, and he started giving his money to the beggars, and it turned into a riot. I mean, literally, people were coming from every nook and cranny that he was totally surrounded and had no money. He just gave everything away. And so, I don't know. I guess there's the thing about the self-empathy and holding your needs and as well. So,
no, I think you got it perfectly accurate. That's what we're talking about. If you think that if you help this large group of people, it's not going to make a difference because there are larger, broad institutional failures in this country that are going to prevent any of your help from having any real impact. So if you think your help is going to be a drop in the bucket, you're like, well, why should I even bother? And I'm just going to turn off my compassion. And so that's very good way of putting it. What you were saying.
So and then you're looking at the. And then there's a cost that if I do that, if I do turn off my compassion to the person, that there's actually kind of some kind of a moral cost, or some kind of an alienation maybe, or
that's a good way of putting it. Alienation. That actually captures quite a bit of what we were going for. So the idea is that if I do turn off my compassion, how does that change how I think about myself morally? Does it make me feel like I'm a bad person? And so we have, my advisor, Keith Payne, and I have a paper in Psychological Science where we talk about the cost of callousness, so to speak. And it's this notion that if you get people to turn off their compassion towards suffering victims, it creates a kind of what's called a cognitive dissonance. It creates a sense of inconsistency of your behavior with your moral standards and values. And we found in one study that when you tell people to turn off compassion, by comparison to telling people to turn off other emotions or by letting them feel their compassion, it causes changes in how much they care about morality, and also in their beliefs that in their moral principles, in their beliefs that we should always follow the rules. And we find that we have these interesting trade-offs where if you turn off your compassion, it forces this sacrifice between your sense of yourself as caring about morality and your principles about always following moral rules. So it's one study, it's preliminary, but we think it's suggestive that all these scholars from all kinds of religious traditions and philosophical traditions have argued that compassion is such a central force. There are some who don't agree with that. There are some, I think Ayn Rand comes up as one example who disagrees that compassion has any real moral importance. And I think Immanuel Kant said something similar, that compassion wasn't really that crucial for moral action. What mattered was duty. But we're showing that, at least for this segment of the population that we tested, get them to turn off compassion, it has moral consequences. It changes how they think about themselves morally. So what we're interested in doing next to follow up on that is to see, well, if you turn off compassion, does it carry over into actual moral behavior? So if you turn off your compassion, does it create a sense of a kind of moral numbing where you're then more okay with acting unethically and morally in some future context? So that's where we're going with that.
Yeah, it's in turn when you say morality, one source of morality that I've heard is like, you know, why, I guess kind of is the question of what is morality. And it's kind of like there could be the golden rule, you know, do unto others as you have them do unto you, or more of a, it's kind of an empathic. I'm not doing something because there's a rule, you know, towards you. I'm doing because I have a sense of connection to you, and there seems to be a sense that people want to contribute to the welfare of others that they feel connected to. I don't know if there's proof of this, but I've seen studies of, you know, like children, you know, they're like struggling, the parent is trying to struggle to reach something, and the child, I mean, 2 years old or less, you see that they just have this impulse to want to contribute to the parents and pick up that object and give it to them. So it's seeing morality as actually stemming from that empathic connection of seeing the humanity of others. And then there seems to be a version of morality, which is, here's this strict set of rules, you know, follow those rules. And if you don't follow those rules, you know, you'll be punished for it. So those are kind of two sets of morality that I see. Is there, how are you seeing morality?
So I tend to agree that, I mean, partly from my own kind of philosophical background and life experiences, that, I mean, there's something very important about the emotional impulses that we have when we're faced with others who are suffering. There's something very important about this natural, compassionate impulse that we often have. And more broadly, theoretically, I think that oftentimes what happens is that it's not that we lack the compassionate impulse towards others, but that we sometimes decide to turn it off. And that has interesting consequences. As for rules, I know that, you know, moral emotions don't matter. Like, compassion isn't seen as morally relevant at all, and it's all about duty and following rules and so forth. And I don't want to say that that approach is invalid. When I'm totally open to the possibility that there have evolved multiple kind of moral styles, as it were, for thinking about what morality is. So, you know, Jonathan Haidt has some wonderful work on subcultural differences in how morality is defined. So I you know, I guess I have to admit that there's going to be a bit of subjectivity in how you think about what is appropriately considered moral or not. It's possible that both are necessary. You need to have strict moral rules and the automatic emotional impulses. You know, together, they've co-evolved to create the most harmonious situation possible. I think it's certainly an open question. And then you also have the groups that suggest that it's not about others at all. It's all about self-actualization. So some of the Randian types, and you know, those types, they argue that compassion doesn't matter at all. And there, I strongly disagree. I think compassion is centrally important. I think there might be multiple facets of morality, and not any one of them is going to be kind of the be-all and end-all of how we think about what morality is. But yeah, it's certainly fun to argue this over coffee or beer or what have you. Because there's not going to be a firm answer coming anytime soon.
Yeah, it's keeping that multiple perspectives as your value is looking at and kind of exploring it from different angles. In terms of your work on compassion, do you look at presence? Because there's a part of compassion would be being present with someone. It's like not kind of turning off or turning away, but somebody can be in deep distress and you're just present with them. It doesn't mean you're, giving them money or anything, but that you're just having that sense of presence and not alienating, not saying, oh, forget it, putting up that wall. And I guess that would also bring up the question of physically what's going on in you when you turn away, like you're talking about. Are there physical dimensions to that? Like when I'm feeling present with someone, I feel like an openness and expansion. And when I'm close to someone, I can viscerally feel in my body a certain constriction. And have you looked at those kind of components too? Because that's stuff that can really be measured.
Yeah. So in my research thus far, I haven't looked at psychophysiology. I agree that's really interesting. There's a lot of wonderful work in social psychology about embodied metaphors for social emotional experiences, such that, when you feel compassion for someone, you actually feel warmer. So the emotional metaphor has a certain physiological basis, and vice versa. When you turn off your compassion, you may feel a little bit colder. And that does reduce down to some neurophysiological stuff that's happening. I know I haven't done it myself, but there's some interesting work on the vagus nerve. So it's this nerve that, if I have my physiology anatomy correct, it goes from your heart up to your brain. It regulates various functions. It's certain patterns of heart rhythms. So yeah, it's a little bit outside of where I focus currently. It's a direction I might move into in the future. But there is a lot of interesting work on the physiological basis for, embracing or rejecting compassion. And, so if you're in a room with someone and you do something as simple as put your hand on that person's arm. I mean, so Dr. Keltner has some stuff on how that's a really reliable indicator, a nonverbal indicator of compassion, just caressing someone. And so being there and present in that sense, even if you're not helping in any other way, the nonverbal communication could be enough to really affect important changes for the person who's most in need of help.
Yeah, so it's really about that turning away in terms of presence somehow then. And if we start disconnecting our presence, that it has a cost to us. And that cost is that the more we do it, the less we're willing to follow the rules, and so we're kind of we're maybe wiring our brains neurologically, strengthening those neurons, those fear-based or detachment kind of processes.
Yeah. So I mean, there's one question I've been interested in is what happens if you are the kind of person who continues to turn off your compassion? You might argue that it would have accumulating downsides, that it would potentially corrode your ability to effectively connect with others. A lot of people have speculated about that, but no one's ever really tested that idea. That if I turn off my compassion, we know from research that in the short term, it can cause you to care less about being a moral person, and it can also make you think it's more okay to bend moral rules. Well, that's just a short term. That's just an in-lab experiment, a one-off thing. What happens if you're in a place like what if you're in a profession where you're told you can't express compassion for the people you work with? I know there's debate about this in the medical sciences, in courtroom settings. There are a lot of norms about how to express and regulate your emotions in different professional contexts. There's a lot of work in the business literature about this notion of emotional labor that builds on that. So if you're in that kind of profession and you have to keep turning off your compassion, are there residual long-term consequences? And those might be very important because in some cases, those consequences might interfere with the effective or fair application of rules within the job you're working. So, yeah, it's a long answer. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, when you were saying that, it was I was thinking of turning off that compassion, and I would say empathy as well would be in a war situation for soldiers who are turning off their empathy and compassion towards the enemy, and especially in some place like Iraq or Afghanistan, we don't know who the enemy even is, and so. And then you hear of soldiers coming back and they have this post-traumatic stress. And it seems to be a large part of that is kind of that having turned off their compassion and just having difficulty in connecting.
Yeah, so there's a really good Simon Baron-Cohen, who's done a lot of work on empathy and autism. He has a recent book, I want to say it's called, oh shoot, I can't remember the title. It has 0 on it.
Yeah, 0 degrees of empathy.
0 degrees of empathy, exactly.
And then there's 2 versions of the book. That's the British title, and then there's an American version, and it's called the Science of Evil.
Oh, that's tough. I think I like the first title better, honestly. But yeah. So, but I know he discusses, if I remember correctly, in his book, he discusses this idea of when we turn off our empathy and then our compassion for someone, we're turning a person into an object. We're turning a human into something that's in the way of, or perhaps, a means to our goal, whatever that may be. When you do that, if you engage in that kind of dehumanization, and that could happen in war, but it could also happen in everyday life. It can happen when we pass by someone on the street who asks for money, and we just are like, we feel disgusted and we just keep walking. There's a lot of great work on that in American context, at least. So when we engage in dehumanization, might it fundamentally alter our ability to interact with others as fellow human beings? As far as I know, there hasn't been much work on the long-term downstream consequences of turning off empathy and compassion. But it's, I think, a problem that is going to become increasingly important, both scientifically and morally, as we see more and more PTSD cases and other situations like that.
Well, these dialogues are really framed around how do we build a culture of empathy and compassion. So I'm seeing it as a positive attribute and looking for ideas and strategies to actually foster empathy. And so if we look at it from kind of that point of view, how does from your research, what is it saying about how to foster those qualities in society?
So that's a wonderful question. So I think that my research would suggest a few different possibilities. So going back to that collapse of compassion research, in one of those studies, I found that if you make helping not seem very costly, if you make helping seem easy and not very costly, you reverse the collapse of compassion. People feel more compassion for 8 than for 1 victims, suggesting that perhaps there are short-term interventions that we can utilize to make helping seem less costly, more efficient. That might be one way to build compassion and helping. I know that after the Japanese tsunami and earthquake, if I remember correctly, the Red Cross had this thing where you could text, I think it was just texting the word Red Cross to a pre-specified number on people's smartphones. And it's like, if you text this, you'll donate like $10 to help the victims of this large-scale natural disaster. What intrigued me about that is it's just such an efficient, quick thing you can do, just pressing a button. That's all you have to do. You don't have to think about the cost of helping. You don't have to think about being overwhelmed. You just have to press a button. And you've translated compassion into action. So I gave a talk at Facebook's Compassion Research Day. Saw you there. And it's a lot of interesting stuff about how to build that social interface in a way that could enhance compassion and helping. Perhaps through something as simple as clicking a button. So that's one kind of set of things you could try to do. Find motivational, short-term interventions that get people to be less scared of the costs of help. There are more long-term things I've seen. So at this Science of Compassion conference in Telluride, Colorado, there's a lot of work on more long-term compassion cultivation training programs, ways that you can use lessons from mindfulness traditions, like Buddhism, etc. You can find ways to train your mind to be better able to handle lots of suffering victims. So when you think about how many people are suffering in the world, if you have the mental training to be able to sit with that compassion and not turn away, which is very difficult because most of us would probably want to when it gets really intense. If we can sit with that experience, we might be able to then act on it and not turn away.
Okay, let me see if I'm getting this. It's like, so it's like we can be overwhelmed by the suffering of others. And if as we become overwhelmed, we get maybe afraid. I mean, we have fear maybe for our own well-being. And that, so what you're saying is to create social structures that kind of create small ways of contributing so that people don't feel overwhelmed and maybe fearful in that sense.
Yeah.
It could be, you know, click here, do a couple things. So you create those structures like the Red Cross did to
Yes.
contribute small amounts, and that those small amounts, I guess, would
Yeah.
accumulate. They'd be, you
Yes.
know, and then so then there's the part that we become afraid of being overwhelmed by the suffering of others, and that then there's processes where we can kind of develop our resilience, so that we're more resilient and able to kind of hold and be present with suffering and those processes. We can do kind of like that training to develop that resilience.
Exactly. That's a perfect way of stating it. If we can find ways to learn to be more present with our emotions, with the world, and be less afraid, then we can potentially feel more compassion than people might think we could. And so, yeah, there's a lot of fascinating work that's being done right now on various ways we can train compassion, a long-term meditation, loving kindness interventions that can be very successful. But yeah, it's at the Science of Compassion conference. One of the speakers was Thupten Jinpa, who's the English translator for the Dalai Lama, and at the end of his talk, he suggested that one important future direction in thinking about how to build a compassion is, given the Buddhist mission to increase compassion towards all sentient beings, what do we do when we're faced with this notion of the collapse of compassion? Like, how do we get past this sense of people wanting to turn away from their compassion for so many beings in the world? And it's a topic that it's exciting because there's so much generative work that's happening right now to understand, when do we let ourselves feel compassion, and then when do we turn into a defensive, fear-based mode that shuts that emotion down? And I think that these long-term compassion cultivation programs might be especially useful for building the long-term capacity to feel more. So we can do the short-term stuff that changes motivations, certainly with like maybe Facebook and other social media sites, and those would be very effective, I think. But we can also do things that train you yourself as an individual to have the psychological resilience, as you put it, to deal with compassion experiences.
Well, you mentioned fear. Have you looked at like the essence of fear? Are you like studying what it's like, kind of like if fear is the debilitating quality that inhibits compassion and empathy, it seems like it's really understanding how to address fear and anxiety, and that is an important part in this puzzle.
I definitely agree. I think that targeting like those short-term motivational interventions that might be able to target any fears of experiencing compassion. I mean, that's a very important research direction. I have not looked at the emotional state fear directly in my research thus far, but it's a direction that I could definitely see moving in, certainly.
Yeah, I've told this story before, but I do this freestyle dance, and once in the dance, I was just noticing my own visceral feelings, what's going on in my body, and I thought, well, I have this anxiety, And it feels like kind of like a black spike that kind of goes through my core. And I'm kind of dancing around. I said, you know, instead of like avoiding it, I'm going to try to go to it. I want to expand it to the largest, get as close viscerally, have it fill my conscious, be as present as possible to it. And I kind of let it kind of like open and I got closer to it. And I'm doing this in a, you know, dancing on the freestyle dance floor. And then as I could feel it more and more in my consciousness. And then it seemed to just dissolve, you know, kind of being present with that fear. And then, but it was in like 3 to 5 seconds, a new fear appeared. And it had a different, you know, kind of metaphorical or visceral feeling. It was like more of a heavy kind of a numbness that kind of came on me. I said, okay, there's another one. And I tried to get, I'm going to let it kind of get closer and closer to it, let it fill my consciousness. And then after a while, it kind of dissolved too. And so I did this for like a whole, you know, hour of all kinds of interactions. I was looking for fears within the, you know, within the dance, fears of others, how do I, and at the end, I felt so like in a state of bliss because, and I was kind of like speculating it was that presence of not feeling overwhelmed by the fear, like you're talking about, right? It's like, oh, if I have this fear that's going to overwhelm me and I'm going to like lose it. It was like, you know, being present with it, and I transformed and kind of moved through it. And every time I transformed and went through a fear, it was like my body got a little softer, a little bit more relaxed. And I was kind of like thinking, it's like a little shot of oxytocin or something, you know?
Yeah.
And at the end, I was just like, oh, just so bliss. And it was like one of those, so it was one of these peak experiences. But it really was about the relationship I felt with empathy and fear. You know, it's like how we deal with fear. And that's what I'm hearing you talking about is like, it's this fear of if I'm caring for someone else that, you know, that something bad is going to happen. I'm going to be hurt or something.
Yeah. So I definitely agree. I've also had experiences, not with dancing, but with things like, you know, giving lectures and so on, where if I felt fear, there have been times when I've tried to engage in mindful breathing, where I've tried to just center and just focus on the breath, which is a classic mindfulness training tradition. And yeah, I've had the experience of changing how I relate to the fear. So one of the things they focus on in those traditions is this idea of, you know, changing what you think emotions are, like changing how you relate to your emotions. If you're in a fear state, you just feel like the world is bad, bad things are going to happen. But then if you can look at that mindfully, you can think about, well, this is just a passing emotional state that my body's going through. It's not necessarily reflective of how the world is. It's just subjective experience. So if I can relate to that in a different way, I can move past the fear and I can experience some other emotion like bliss, like compassion. So I do have some research that's ongoing that it doesn't look at fear specifically, but it looks at how things like mindfulness can contribute to helping behavior. This is ongoing work with Barbara Fredrickson. And we looked at whether people who are more mindful are more likely to help others, and also how their emotions change when they do help others. So there's the definition of mindfulness that decomposes it into two parts. One is attention to the present moment, you know, being here now. But then the other part is a kind of acceptance of whatever is going to happen, a kind of non-judgmental acceptance. If I feel fear, then I just like, okay, I can handle it. It's not necessarily bad. I can deal with it. And what we find is that both of those aspects of mindfulness predict whether people engage in helping behavior. And not only that, but that for people who are more attentive to the present moment, they feel more positive emotions like compassion, moral elevation, joy, giddiness. And then people who are more accepting of their experiences actually feel less negative emotions. So things like fear, distress, guilt, shame, other negative emotions like that. So we have so all it is to say, we have some preliminary work that's looking at how things like mindful awareness could facilitate compassion compassionate action and that kind of thing.
Well,
but there's a lot of cool work yet to do.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, we're kind of coming to the close of our dialogue here, so maybe we could look at where do you see your work going and evolving in the future? Kind of where are you now, and where do you want to go?
Oh, well, that's a wonderful question. So, yeah, the funny thing about forecasting evolution is you often end up somewhere you didn't expect in the first place. But yeah, I mean, so for my dissertation research, I'm focusing on how do we think about compassion from the perspective that we often make sense of our emotions in different ways. So in emotions research, there's a lot of work on what's called constructionism, this idea that how we feel emotion is determined by our concepts about emotional experience, how aware we are of our emotions. So our emotional landscapes on this viewpoint are very flexible and open to change. And very broadly, I'm trying to explore the boundary conditions for how we make sense of our compassion. So maybe this will help if I use a concrete example. So if I see an image of a homeless person, I could feel many different emotions, right? I could feel perhaps some disgust. I could feel passion, could feel sadness. What I'm curious about is how do we determine what emotion we are in fact feeling? And how do we understand whether people label what they're feeling as compassion as opposed to disgust? And do people have a choice in how they make sense of their emotional experiences in that context? And how can we understand why they make the labeling choices that they do?
Oh.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just trying to make sure I understand it. So the first part was in terms of where your work is going. It sounds like you kind of follow the thread, the thread of what's kind of coming, where the energy is as you're doing your research. So it can go your work could go in a lot of different directions in the future. But right now, you're looking at, as you experience maybe suffering in others, it's like the visceral feel of that and how that feeling gets translated into words. Is that kind of it? Like what words are attached to that feeling?
So that's a good way of putting it. How we label what we're feeling in those kinds of situations, how we come to understand, am I feeling compassion or am I feeling something like disgust instead? And once we come to an understanding of what we're feeling, that could have very, very diverse implications for whether we help that person, whether we engage in moral behavior. So it's trying to look at this notion of how people shape their own emotional experiences through things like labeling, through things like this. Trying to get a clearer sense of that process. So that's one direction I'm going in. Another direction that came up earlier is following up this notion that if we avoid compassion for others, are there costs for the self? And investigating whether when we avoid compassion for others, does it lead to changes in ethical and moral behavior? So that's another future direction. So it is, like you said, it is kind of following the same line to some degree, what I've done so far, but just trying to push it further. Yeah.
And for that last one, is that one kind of relevant to the war situation, people living in highly stressful situations, be it in the family or in a community. So how do you see testing that kind of?
Well, that's the key question. How do we design the appropriate tests? I think many people assume that you can turn off compassion and that it won't carry over into other situations, right? I think people have this assumption that you can compartmentalize these different experiences and not have carryover effects. Off the top of, this isn't something we're doing yet, but off the top of my head, one thing you could try to do is manipulate whether people engage in compassion avoidance or not. And then put them in some kind of situation, some kind of subsequent situation in which they have the opportunity to do something like cheating or, I don't know, a situation where they could hurt someone, not really hurt someone, but there's some interesting paradigms for like using hot sauce as a kind of punishment technique. I think Carlo has a study with that.
Yeah.
And So yeah, creating a situation in which you get people to avoid compassion or not, and then put them in some follow-up scenario in which they have the opportunity to do something that's moderately unethical. That would be one way to do it, but the key thing is, to find the appropriate scenario to put them in and the right way to get them to avoid compassion, and that is going to require quite a bit of testing.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. Well, this was a fun dialogue. Really appreciate the casualness and exploring, looking at it from all the different perspectives like you're doing. It was a lot of fun.
Well, thank you.
I've learned a lot. Mm-hmm. Sorry, what was that?
I just said, sorry, thanks for inviting me.
Oh.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for taking part, and I hope we can keep the conversations going. We might do some panel discussions in the future, and just keep exploring how we can foster empathy and compassion within society. And great to have researchers like yourself out there, kind of pushing the understanding boundaries of how this all works.
Well, thanks. And I think this is a great forum you've developed to try to bring as many minds together as possible and take as many lenses on this issue as we can, because I think that we need as many voices as we can get access to really understand this phenomena. So it's great what you're doing as well.
Oh, great, Daryl. Okay, well then I'll say goodbye and until the next time. So thanks a lot.
Sounds good. Thank you. Bye.
See the world through other people's eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.